This is my true story. I worked every day of my life to give my son the comfort I never had. I carried him through hunger, sickness, and storms. I gave him a roof, an education, and my strength, until I had nothing left to give. I thought when my body grew weak, his heart would carry me the rest of the way. But one night, he looked at me with tired eyes and said, "You're a burden to me, old man." That moment killed something inside me. You won't believe what I did next. Before I tell you what I did, tell me where you're watching from, and subscribe so more people hear my story. I carried my son before he could even walk. His small hands clung to my shirt while I walked miles to work each morning. I worked 2 jobs so he could eat, study, and sleep under a roof that never leaked. I came home late every night, my clothes soaked in sweat or rain, but I always brought him something, a piece of fruit, a small toy, a smile. I fixed his school shoes when they tore, stitched his torn clothes, and packed his lunch even when I had none for myself. I thought that was what love was, giving until you had nothing left. When he grew older, I worked harder. Every promotion he earned, I celebrated like it was my own. Every mistake he made, I shielded him from it. When people said he was lazy or careless, I told them he just needed time. When he failed his first college exam, I stayed up all night helping him study again. When he fell sick, I sat by his bed with wet towels and soup until the fever broke. I watched him grow into a man and thought my purpose was fulfilled. I paid for his wedding. I handed him the keys to the house I built with my own hands. He said, "Dad, you've done enough." Now it's my turn, I believed him. I truly did. I sold my tools and retired quietly, thinking I would spend my last years in peace, reading, resting, maybe watching my grandchildren play in the yard. I thought my old age would be safe under his roof, the same roof that had kept him safe for decades. At first, life was calm. He bought new furniture, painted the walls, and said he wanted the house to feel modern. I didn't mind. I was proud of him. I ate dinner with him and his wife every night. Sometimes I told stories from when he was small, how I used to carry him to school when it rained, how he would fall asleep on my shoulder. He smiled politely, but his wife rarely did. She often looked at her phone while I spoke. Small things like that didn't bother me then. I told myself times were changing, that maybe young people just showed love differently. Months passed, the smiles became fewer, the words shorter. I started feeling like a guest in my own home. They began locking the main door at night, saying it was for safety. Sometimes when I asked simple things, like help fixing the TV or buying my medicine, they said they were busy. I didn't argue. I told myself they had their own worries, their own lives. But deep inside, I could feel something changing. Still, I tried to help. I watered the plants, washed the car, swept the yard, just to feel useful. I left notes reminding them to eat before leaving for work. I even cooked dinner some nights, hoping they would notice. But they didn't. The food went cold on the table, and they'd come home with takeout instead. I started eating alone in my room. I told myself it was fine. A father should never complain. The house grew quieter, but not peaceful. The kind of quiet that comes before a storm. I began to hear them whisper at night, their voices low but clear enough for me to know they were talking about me. Sometimes my name, sometimes just the word old. I didn't need to hear the rest. I could feel it in the air, the weight of being unwanted. But even then, I kept loving them. I kept waiting for small moments, a thank you, a smile, a sign of care. Because that's what fathers do. We forgive too easily. We hope too long. I never asked for much. Just a place at the table, a few kind words, and the comfort of knowing that all my years of sacrifice had meant something. I didn't know then that love can turn into debt in the eyes of the ungrateful. That one day, the same son I carried on my shoulders would look at me and see only weight. And when that day came, it broke me in a way even time couldn't fix. It happened on a quiet evening, the kind of evening when everything feels calm before life decides to change forever. I was sitting on the porch, watching the sunset. The air was still, and I could hear the sound of dishes clinking inside. His wife was in the kitchen, and he sat across the room, scrolling through his phone. I had been feeling unwell for days. My knees hurt, my chest felt tight, and I hadn't eaten much. So I called out softly, asking if I could have some soup. He didn't answer at first. Then, without looking up, he said, "You'll have to wait, Dad. We're busy." I waited. I always did. I sat there quietly until the house grew darker. Finally, he came out, wiping his hands. His face looked tired, colder than usual. He leaned against the wall and sighed. "Dad," he said slowly, "we need to talk." My heart sank, though I didn't know why yet. He said it the way people do before saying something that can't be taken back. His wife joined him, standing beside him like a shadow. He took a deep breath and looked straight at me. "You're a burden." The words didn't echo, they just sank. They didn't shout, they didn't sting at first, they just landed, flat, heavy, final. I looked at him, hoping I had misheard, but he didn't flinch. His voice wasn't angry, it was calm, cold, like he had rehearsed it. "You're a burden, Dad. We can't keep doing this. You need too much help. You don't understand how hard things are for us." Behind him, his wife nodded. She didn't say a word, but her face said enough. That quiet agreement was worse than shouting. I could feel the air leave my lungs. I wanted to speak, to remind him of all the nights I stayed awake when he had fevers, of the days I skipped meals to buy his books, of the years I worked through pain so he could have comfort. But no words came. My throat locked. My chest tightened until I could barely breathe. He looked down at the floor, not at me, and added, "You should start thinking about moving into a care home. Somewhere they can look after you properly." Properly. That word hit harder than the rest. It sounded like a kind excuse, but I heard the truth underneath. They wanted me gone. My hands started to tremble, not from age but from disbelief. I looked at the home I had built brick by brick. The walls still had the marks from when he was a child. Tiny pencil lines measuring his height every year. I looked at the doorway where I used to wait for him after school. And now, in the same house, my own son was telling me I didn't belong anymore. His wife crossed her arms and said softly, "It's for your good, really." I wanted to ask her if she had ever known what good meant, if she had ever known what sacrifice looked like. But I stayed silent. The quiet felt safer than breaking down. He left the room soon after, like the conversation was finished. She followed him, turning off the lights behind her. I sat there in the dark, my ears ringing with one word: burden. A word I never thought I'd hear from the mouth of the child I raised. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching the shadows move across the walls. I thought about the years I carried him on my shoulders, how light he used to be. Now, his words felt heavier than all the weight I had ever lifted. I realized then that love is not a promise. It's a gamble. You give everything, hoping they'll remember. And sometimes they don't. Sometimes they grow strong enough to stand tall and forget the hands that held them up. And that night, sitting in the dark, I made a silent vow. I might be old, but I was not done. The same hands that built his life could still unmake it. The days that followed were slower, heavier. The air in the house changed. It wasn't anger that filled it. It was something colder. Distance. I could feel it in every sound, every silence. They didn't speak much to me anymore, and when they did, it was only out of obligation. I stopped hearing Dad. It became him or he. Small changes, but they cut deep. The kind of wounds that don't bleed, just stay open. I told myself it would pass, that maybe my son had spoken in frustration. But every day that followed proved it wasn't a mistake. He meant every word. It started with small things. My chair disappeared from the dinner table one evening. When I asked why, his wife said, "We're just trying a new layout." But the truth was, there was no space for me anymore. They began leaving food outside my room instead of calling me to eat. Cold plates covered with foil, sometimes soup, sometimes rice. Never enough to make me full. They stopped asking what I wanted to eat or if I needed anything from the market. My son used to check on me before bed. Now I heard his door lock instead. I tried to stay quiet. I didn't want to argue or complain. I spent most of my time sitting by the window, staring at the road. Sometimes children passed by, laughing as they chased a ball, and I wondered when my son had stopped being that innocent. When had the laughter turned to irritation? When had love turned to duty? I heard them whisper at night. Their room was just down the hall, his voice low, hers sharp. I couldn't make out all the words, but I heard enough. Expenses, responsibility, retirement money, old. I stopped listening after that. I didn't need to know the rest. The truth was simple. I had become an inconvenience in the house I built. He told me one morning, "Dad, it's better if you rest more and talk less. You get tired easily." I nodded and went back to my room, but I knew what he really meant. Talk less. Be quiet. Don't be seen. Don't be felt. Don't exist more than necessary. The humiliation came quietly, not in shouting or insults, but in the way they looked through me, like I was furniture, like I was a shadow taking up space. There's a kind of cruelty in silence. It doesn't bruise the skin, it bruises the soul. One evening, I tried to tell him about an old friend who had passed away. He was watching television. I said his name once, then twice. He didn't turn his head. His wife looked at me and said, "He's tired, Dad. Maybe tomorrow." But tomorrow never came. Every story I tried to tell stayed unfinished. Every memory I tried to share died halfway in my throat. I began sleeping earlier, not because I was tired, but because the nights were too long when you have no one to talk to. I'd sit in bed, listening to the clock tick. Sometimes I'd hear them laughing in the next room, soft but sharp. I used to think laughter was the sound of love. Now it felt like a reminder that I didn't belong in the same world anymore. Still, I didn't hate him. I couldn't. The heart doesn't unlearn love, even when it's crushed under its own weight. But something inside me shifted. A quiet understanding that this was no longer my home. I was no longer his father in his eyes. I was something else. A reminder of debt, of duty, of inconvenience. I looked at the walls I had painted, the floors I had polished, the roof I had fixed. I remembered holding him in these same rooms when he cried as a child. I remembered telling him that kindness was the only thing that made a man strong. Now he lived in comfort built by my hands, and I sat in the shadows, forgotten by those same hands. Every small act, the food outside the door, the missing chair, the locked conversations, felt like bricks in a wall they were building between us. And with every passing day, I realized they were not pushing me out. They were slowly erasing me. And soon, there would be nothing left of me here but the sound of the ticking clock, counting down to the day I'd stop existing under his roof. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling. The house was silent, but my mind wasn't. Every word he said replayed in my head again and again. "You're a burden." It echoed until it became a heartbeat. I turned to my side and looked at the small photo frame on the table, a picture of him when he was 7, missing a front tooth, smiling proudly as I held his new school bag. I used to look at that picture and feel warmth. That night, all I felt was ache. The clock ticked softly. I counted each sound like it was measuring the distance between who he used to be and who he had become. My hands rested on my chest, trembling slightly. Not from sickness, but from something colder. Betrayal doesn't break you all at once. It seeps into you slowly, like water leaking into wood, swelling and cracking it from within. I thought about every night I'd stayed awake for him, every sacrifice I had made, every time I told myself that love was enough. And now, love had turned into pity. I got up and walked to the window. The moon was pale, the sky heavy with clouds. Rain hadn't fallen yet, but I could smell it coming. I sat by the window, letting the faint wind brush against my face. The house felt smaller now. My world had shrunk to 4 walls and silence. I used to dream of this stage of life as peaceful, reading old books, watering plants, watching the sun rise without worry. But peace doesn't live where love has died. My knees ached when I stood, but I didn't care. I walked to the kitchen, opened the cupboard, and poured myself a glass of water. On the fridge was a note written by his wife. "Don't forget to pay the internet bill." I stared at it for a long time. There was no note for me, no reminder, no word of kindness. I realized I had become invisible in my own home, useful only for what I could give, never for who I was. I sat down at the small table and closed my eyes. My mind wandered to the nights when he was a boy, crying from a nightmare, running into my room, whispering, "Dad, don't leave me." I would hold him until he fell asleep. Now the same boy had grown into a man who couldn't stand my presence for 5 minutes. The same voice that once called me hero now called me burden. The same hands that once held mine in fear now shut doors in my face. Tears came, but they didn't fall. They just stayed there, heavy and still. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even surprised. I was just empty. Emptied by time, by silence, by years of giving without being seen. There's a kind of pain that doesn't shout. It just breathes quietly, waiting for something inside you to decide that enough is enough. I went back to my room and sat on the edge of the bed. The walls around me were covered in pictures: his graduation, his wedding, the new car he bought. Every photo was a story of his life, and I was the shadow in the background, fading more with each one. I stared at them until the faces blurred. My heart didn't hurt anymore. It just felt heavy, like it was filled with stones. As the night deepened, I made a quiet promise to myself. I wouldn't shout. I wouldn't beg. I wouldn't demand love from those who had already replaced it with convenience. I would not wait for respect from people who had forgotten what it looked like. I would do what I had always done: stay calm, think carefully, act quietly. The difference now was simple. This time, I would act for myself. When dawn came, the first light slipped through the curtains, touching the photo on the wall. I looked at it one last time, then turned away. The father who begged for love was gone. What remained was a man ready to give one final gift, not out of anger, but out of truth. And in that long, sleepless night, I knew what I had to do. Morning came slow. The light pushed through the curtains like it was afraid to wake me. My body felt heavy, but my mind was awake. Too awake. I sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. The cold from the tiles pressed through my feet, but I didn't move. I had lived my whole life trying to be patient, trying to forgive, trying to understand. But patience turns poisonous when it is never returned. That morning, I stopped being patient. I stopped being the father who waited for change. I became the man who would make it happen. I looked around the room, at the small dresser, the clock, the folded clothes. Every inch of it told a story of someone who had stayed too long. My old body, my tired hands, they had given enough. I didn't want revenge. I wanted peace. But peace sometimes needs to be earned the hard way. I stood slowly and walked to the drawer near the bed. Inside were papers I hadn't touched in years. My will, my property deed, the bank statements, the insurance. I pulled them out one by one and placed them neatly on the table. His name was on every page. His signature on some. His future written in ink beside mine. I stared at it, and a quiet thought passed through my mind. Not anymore. I picked up a pen and wrote a small note on the back of an envelope. You will understand one day. Just 7 words. Nothing more. I didn't need to explain myself. The truth was already loud enough in the silence of this house. I folded the note and slid it between the papers. My hands didn't shake this time. They were steady, calm, focused, almost relieved. I dressed slowly, putting on the same gray shirt I wore every Sunday. I looked at myself in the mirror. My face was older, lined with years of work and worry, but for the first time in a long while, my eyes looked alive. There was no anger in them, only clarity. I took a deep breath and walked out into the hall. The house was quiet. They were still asleep. The smell of coffee drifted faintly from the kitchen, where his wife must have prepared things the night before. I passed their door and stopped for a second, listening. Nothing but soft breathing. I went to the study where my old files were kept. On the top shelf was a black folder marked Personal. I opened it and pulled out an old card. My lawyer's number, faded but still clear. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but he was the only one I trusted. I sat down in the chair by the window, dialed the number, and waited. When his voice came on the line, calm and steady, I said, "It's time to make some changes." He paused. "Are you sure?" "Yes," I said. "Completely." He told me to come by that afternoon. I agreed. I placed the phone down and looked outside at the small garden I had planted years ago. The flowers were still there, growing in quiet defiance, even though no one cared for them anymore. Maybe that's what I had become. Something forgotten, but still living. I spent the rest of the morning gathering things I wanted to take. Just a few clothes, my wedding ring, the photo of my wife and me when life was still gentle. I didn't need anything else. The rest would stay behind, just like the memories. Before leaving, I walked through the house one last time. The living room where he had taken his first steps. The kitchen where his mother had laughed while cooking. The porch where we used to sit together on rainy days. Everything I built, everything I gave, it was all still here. But none of it belonged to me anymore. It belonged to a stranger's idea of comfort. I turned off the lights and stood by the door for a moment. My heart didn't hurt, it was just quiet. I whispered softly, "You'll remember this, son. Maybe not today, but someday." Then I stepped out, not as a burden, but as a man who had finally remembered his worth. And as I closed the door behind me, I didn't feel sorrow. I felt freedom dressed as silence. The walk to my lawyer's office felt longer than usual. Maybe it was because I was no longer rushing to anywhere. I was walking toward an ending, and endings deserve slow steps. The morning air was cold, brushing against my face like memory itself. I held a small folder under my arm, filled with papers that had once tied my son's future to mine. I used to carry that folder with pride. Now I carried it with purpose. The difference between pride and purpose is that one looks backward, the other looks forward. That day, I was done looking back. When I entered the office, the same lawyer I had trusted for years looked up in quiet surprise. He had grown older too, but his eyes still held respect. "It's been a long time," he said. "Yes," I replied. "But it's time to put everything in order." He nodded slowly, as if he understood more than I said. I sat across from him, opened the folder, and began handing him the documents. Property deeds, savings accounts, insurance policies. All neatly arranged, all marked with the same name beside mine, my son's. I pointed to each one and said, "We'll remove him from everything." The lawyer looked at me for a moment before asking, "Are you sure you want this?" I smiled faintly. "He called me a burden," I said softly. "So I'll leave him with the weight of that word." He didn't ask again. He began typing. The sound of the keyboard filled the quiet room like a clock counting down to freedom. Each click was a nail in the coffin of my silence. I told him I wanted everything to go to a charity, the one that fed and cared for elderly people who had no one. "Let the money feed those who are forgotten," I said. "Let it remind them that kindness still exists somewhere." He nodded and began drafting the changes. It took hours, papers to sign, witnesses to confirm. Every signature felt like lifting a stone off my chest. My hands were steady, my breath calm. I had never been so certain about anything in my life. When the last page was done, he slid the documents toward me and said, "It's all official now." But I wasn't done yet. I took out a small envelope from my coat. "There's one more thing," I said. Inside was a note I had written before dawn, short, plain, honest. "To my son, this is my final gift to you. Not of money, but of memory." I told my lawyer to deliver it to him after I was gone, along with a small package I'd prepare myself. He agreed. When I left the office, I didn't feel regret. I didn't feel victory either. What I felt was balance, the kind that comes when you finally set a crooked picture straight. I walked home slowly, passing by the same bakery where I used to buy my son's favorite bread. The smell brought back a rush of old Sundays, laughter, crumbs, small hands reaching across the table. For a second, I almost stopped. But then I remembered the night he took my chair away. The laughter had changed since then. At home, I went to my room and opened a small wooden box. Inside was an old house key, the one to the home I built with my hands, the same one he had turned into a place of silence. I wiped the dust off it and placed it inside a new envelope. Then I folded my note and slipped it beside the key. The two things together, a key and a message, would be my gift. Simple, but unforgettable. I sealed the envelope and wrote his name on it with slow, careful strokes. "To my son," I whispered. "May this unlock something you'll never forget." I didn't write another word. Some lessons don't need long letters. They only need time. As the evening sun fell through the window, I placed the envelope inside the box and handed it to the lawyer the next morning. When I walked away from him, I didn't look back. My gift was ready, quiet, heavy, and waiting. It wasn't a gift of love or hate. It was the truth, wrapped in consequence. And one day soon, it would find him. The package reached him on a gray Thursday morning, the kind of morning that sits heavy in the air when the world feels half asleep. The mailman left it by the door because no one came to answer. My son was inside, still getting ready for work, still living the same life he thought would last forever. The moment he picked up the brown box, something about it made him pause. My handwriting, the same one that had written him birthday cards when he was little, was on the label. From Dad. 2 small words, but they made his chest tighten. He brought the box inside, placed it on the kitchen counter, and stared at it for a long time. His wife asked what it was, but he didn't answer. For a second, he thought about calling me, but then remembered the last time we spoke. The way he told me I was a burden. The way I looked at him and said nothing. He pushed the memory away and opened the box. Inside, he found a single envelope wrapped in white paper. No money, no papers, no long letter. Just one envelope with his name written on it in slow, deliberate strokes. He tore it open carefully. Inside was a small house key and a folded letter. His fingers trembled slightly when he unfolded the paper. It read, "This key opens the house you once called home. It no longer belongs to you. It belongs to those who know how to care for others. This was my final gift to you, not out of anger, but out of truth. You called me a burden. I carried that word until it broke. Now, let the silence you left behind teach you what love costs." He read it twice, then 3 times. His throat felt dry. He didn't understand at first, but then it hit him. He ran to his desk, grabbed his phone, and called the lawyer's number. It went to voicemail. He called again. Still nothing. When the lawyer finally picked up, his voice was calm. "Yes, your father came to see me," he said. "He changed everything. The house, the savings, the insurance, all donated. He asked me to send you that package when it was done." My son didn't speak for a long moment. He stood in the middle of the room, eyes wide, staring at the letter in his hand. His wife took it from him and began reading. By the time she finished, her face had turned pale. "So, we don't own this house anymore?" she whispered. He didn't answer. He walked to the living room wall where the framed deed once hung. It was gone. The lawyer had already taken care of it. Every paper, every signature, every link between my name and his had been erased. The roof he once called his, the roof I built, now belonged to strangers. He sank into the couch, silent. The silence was heavier than any words. His wife began to cry, saying something about where they would go, what they would do. But his ears barely heard her. His mind was elsewhere, replaying every moment he'd dismissed me, every sigh, every time he left food outside my room instead of calling me to eat. Each small cruelty now felt like a stone dropped in his chest. The same key he once used to shut me out now sat on his palm, cold and useless. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the envelope, reading the letter again and again until the words blurred. The house felt colder, the silence louder. For the first time, he understood what loneliness really meant, not the kind that comes from being alone, but the kind that comes from being left behind. In the days that followed, he packed what he could. The rest was taken by the new caretakers, the ones who ran the elderly foundation. They walked through the house gently, thanking him for donating such a generous home. He didn't correct them, he just nodded, speechless. By the end of the week, the house was empty. The walls echoed when he walked. He left with nothing but a letter, a key, and a silence that would follow him forever. And somewhere far away, I sat by a window with my tea, watching the rain, calm, peaceful, free. My gift had been delivered. The news spread faster than I ever thought it would. Small towns carry stories like wind carries dust, quiet at first, then everywhere. My son didn't realize how many people already knew what had happened. The Care Foundation posted a photo of the donated house on their community board. They thanked a humble father who gave his home to the forgotten. My name was there in bold letters. His wasn't. That photo reached his co-workers, his neighbors, and even his old friends from college, the same people he used to brag to about his inheritance and responsibility. By lunchtime, everyone knew the truth. He was sitting in his office when his manager walked in with a printed page in hand. "Is this your father?" he asked. My son froze. The photo showed me shaking hands with the foundation team, smiling faintly, the caption underneath reading, "After years of being called a burden, he left everything to those who would never say the same." My son didn't answer. The manager just nodded slowly and said, "Take the day off." He left the building under 100 silent eyes. Some were shocked, some were pitying, but most were judging. The man who had once laughed about moving his old father out was now the man everyone whispered about. He could feel the whispers following him like shadows all the way to the car. When he reached home, strangers were already there, workers from the foundation finishing the move. They were polite, gentle, and professional. They packed the remaining things that belonged to the property, as everything now legally fell under their care. His wife stood by the doorway, eyes red, asking questions no one could answer. "Where will we go? How did this happen? What will people think?" He didn't respond. He couldn't. His voice had vanished somewhere between disbelief and regret. He walked to the living room, to the wall that had once held his wedding photo, his framed degrees, and the house deed. The wall was bare now. Even the marks left behind by the nails looked emptier than before. The man from the foundation approached him gently and handed over a paper to sign, a formal notice of transfer. My son read the heading, "Final Relinquishment of Property Rights," and felt the world tilt slightly. His signature had once given him ownership. Now it was the same motion taking it away. He signed without a word. When the workers left, the house was silent. His wife sat on the floor, crying softly. He stood by the window, looking out at the garden. The same garden I once planted with my hands, the one he said was old-fashioned. The flowers were gone, replaced with boxes. For the first time, he realized that the house didn't just lose things, it had lost its soul. Later that evening, the lawyer called him to confirm that all transfers were complete. His voice was calm, almost sympathetic. "Your father wanted this to be handled with dignity," he said. "He didn't want revenge. He wanted peace." Those words hit harder than any punishment could. Peace. That was the one thing my son no longer had. He sat at the table long after the call ended, staring at the key in his hand. The same one from the package. The same one that now opened nothing. By nightfall, the town had stopped whispering. They didn't need to. The silence spoke for them. His wife packed her bags 2 days later. She told him she couldn't live in a house that wasn't theirs and couldn't face the pity in people's eyes. When she left, she didn't look back. He tried calling me after that, 3 times, then 4. Each time, his calls went unanswered. The number was still active, but I never picked up. There are silences that heal, and there are silences that teach. Mine was both. I heard from the lawyer later that he moved into a small apartment on the edge of town. No car, no savings, just a few clothes and his guilt. People said he looked older than me now. Tired, sunken, quieter. They said he rarely spoke to anyone anymore. I didn't smile when I heard that. I didn't need to. Some lessons are too sacred for joy. He had finally learned that burden is not a word, it's a wound. And this time, it was carved on his heart. He woke up one morning and realized silence had a weight. It sat on his chest heavier than guilt, heavier than grief. The house he once filled with noise was gone, replaced by a one-room apartment that smelled of dust and old paint. The curtains were thin, the bed too small, the walls too close. Every sound from outside, footsteps, doors shutting, buses passing, reminded him of a world that had kept moving while he stood still. The world didn't miss him. It never does when pride collapses. He sat by the window, staring at the cracked streetlight, thinking about how quiet a life can become after the noise of cruelty fades away. His phone stayed on the table, dark and still. No calls, no messages, no laughter from the woman who once called herself his wife. He thought of her sometimes, not with anger, but with emptiness. She left because she couldn't stand shame, not because she missed love. He didn't blame her for that. Shame burns deeper than hunger. And in the nights that followed, he understood that hunger could be fed. But shame never leaves. He tried to work again, but no one wanted to hire the man whose father donated his house to charity after being called a burden. People whispered, even when they smiled. They offered him pity when he wanted distance. He hated pity. It reminded him of the way I used to look at him, softly, forgivingly, even when he failed. He remembered how I used to fix his coat before school, how I sat up waiting when he came home late, how I hid my tired hands behind my back so he wouldn't feel guilty seeing how hard I worked for him. The memories became knives, small, dull, but endless. At night, he stopped sleeping. The dark made him remember. He remembered the day he called me a burden, how the words rolled off his tongue easily, like a joke told one too many times. He remembered my face, calm but silent, the way I looked down instead of shouting back. He had mistaken that silence for weakness. Now he understood it was strength, the kind he never had. Weeks passed, and the small apartment began to feel smaller. Bills piled up. He sold his watch, then his car. Each thing he lost carried a memory he wished he could trade back. He walked past the foundation sometimes, standing across the street, watching the house he once called his own. The garden had grown again. New flowers, fresh paint, laughter from volunteers. Old people sat on the porch drinking tea, talking about their lives. The house was alive again, just not for him. He stood there for a long time every time he passed, watching in silence, his hands stuffed in his pockets, his eyes wet but hidden. Some days, he thought about coming to find me, to knock on whatever door I now lived behind, to kneel and say sorry. But he never did. Maybe because he didn't know where I was. Maybe because he didn't know how to start. Or maybe because deep inside, he knew forgiveness wasn't his to ask for anymore. It had already been spent the day he called me a burden. I didn't need to see him to know how he lived. I could imagine it. The silence, the regret, the way every small kindness reminded him of what he threw away. I didn't want revenge. I only wanted him to feel what I had felt, to sit at a table and realize no one's coming to eat with you, to look at an empty chair and remember who once sat there. I lived quietly now, far from the noise of the world. The mornings were peaceful. Birds came to my window, and the air smelled of calm. I didn't think of him every day anymore. Time has a way of softening even the hardest pain. But sometimes, when the rain hit the roof, I would whisper to myself, "He called me a burden." But I was the one who carried him all his life. And now, for the first time, I carried nothing. No anger, no weight, no shame, just peace. The years passed slowly, but softly. I lived in a small house near the edge of a quiet town, a place where no one knew my name, and that was enough. I planted flowers in the backyard, the kind that grew even in poor soil. I watered them every morning and sat by the window watching the sun rise over their fragile petals. Life had finally stopped shouting. It whispered now, gently, peacefully, like it was sorry for what it had once been. I learned that peace doesn't come when you forgive others. It comes when you stop needing them to understand. Some evenings, I would sit outside with a cup of tea and listen to the wind brushing through the trees. The silence felt different now. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was clean. I didn't replay the past or wonder why it all went wrong. I had already answered that question 1,000 times. The answer was simple. Love can build a home, but pride can burn it faster than fire. My son had burned his, not with flames, but with words. And yet, even after everything, I didn't wish him pain. I only wished he would finally feel what I had felt for so many years, the quiet weight of being unseen. Sometimes I still dreamt of him as a little boy, running barefoot across the yard, holding my hand, asking me to lift him up to see the stars. I used to think those dreams were punishment, reminders of what I'd lost. But now, I think they were my heart trying to forgive itself. It's strange how love never really dies. It just changes shape. It turns from warmth to distance, from giving to letting go. That's what peace truly is. Not revenge, not regret, just release. I heard from a distant neighbor once that he was living alone now. They said he had grown quiet, that he walked with his head down and rarely spoke to anyone. They said his eyes looked far away, like he was always listening for something that never came. I didn't ask for more details. I didn't need to. I already knew the sound he was waiting for, the knock of forgiveness that would never come. Some doors, once closed, are meant to stay closed. In my old age, I found something I never had when I was younger: stillness. I used to fill my life with work, with worry, with the noise of duty. I thought purpose meant keeping everyone else alive, even if it meant burying myself in silence. But purpose can also mean saving the small, tired part of yourself that still believes in kindness. That's what I did. I didn't destroy him. I simply stopped saving him. And that, I realized, was enough. One evening, the sunset came red and low. I sat in my chair, watching the light fall across the table. The same table I once shared with my son. The same chair where I had waited for him to come home. I smiled. Not out of joy, but out of understanding. Some stories don't end in forgiveness or reunion. Some just end quietly, the way the sea meets the shore. Endlessly, gently, without apology. I took one last sip of tea, leaned back, and let my eyes close for a moment. If someone had walked in then, they might have thought I was sleeping. But I wasn't. I was remembering. Remembering everything, the burden, the silence, the lesson. And for the first time, it didn't hurt. Final thought. He called me a burden. But the truth is, I was his foundation. And when he kicked it away, he learned the hardest truth of all. The house only falls when the pillar finally walks away.